If the New Madrid seismic zone is a name you have never heard, hit like and subscribe to Signal Watch, because what you are about to learn about the ground beneath the American Midwest will change how you think about earthquake risk in this country. Drop a comment below. Tell me where you are watching from, what time it is there, and this. Do you live or work in Memphis, St. Louis, Little Rock, Evansville, or anywhere within several hundred miles of the Mississippi River Valley? Because if the answer is yes, this investigation is not theoretical for you. It is your address. And if you know someone who lives in the Midwest and thinks earthquake preparedness is a West Coast problem, share this video with them. You are the reason we can keep doing this work. Thank you. Here's what this investigation covers: the discovery, the history, and the specific geological architecture of a fault system buried beneath the most vulnerable ground in the United States, ground that FEMA has formally assessed as capable of producing the highest economic losses from any natural disaster in American history. The specific event that happened 3 weeks ago that put the New Madrid seismic zone back in the center of attention for seismologists at the Center for Earthquake Research and Information at the University of Memphis. The mechanism of soil liquefaction, the process by which the deep, water-saturated sediments of the Mississippi River Valley turn into quicksand during major earthquakes, and why it is a threat unlike anything the West Coast has ever faced. And the honest assessment of the three most contested questions in the science: when, how big, and whether anyone is prepared. Now, let's get into it.
There are two earthquake realities in the United States, and the country is only having a serious conversation about one of them. The first reality is California's. The San Andreas fault system has been the defining frame for American earthquake risk since the 1906 San Francisco earthquake leveled the city, since the 1994 Northridge event killed 57 people and caused $25 billion in damage, since the 1989 Loma Prieta earthquake interrupted the World Series and sent a section of the Bay Bridge into the water. California has active fault lines, frequent earthquakes, generations of public education about earthquake preparedness, and decades of investment in seismic building codes and retrofitting programs. The risk is real, the science is robust, and the public discourse is proportionate to it. The second reality exists beneath the states that most Americans think of as completely safe from seismic hazard: Missouri, Arkansas, Tennessee, Kentucky, Illinois, Indiana, and Mississippi. It has a name, the New Madrid seismic zone, and the FEMA assessment of what a major earthquake in this zone would do is not qualified, not hedged, and not ambiguous. FEMA has formally projected that a major New Madrid earthquake would result in the highest economic losses due to a natural disaster in the United States, not the highest earthquake losses. The highest losses from any natural disaster, period. That assessment was not written in the 19th century when geologic understanding was primitive. It was published in November 2008, based on detailed damage modeling by researchers from Virginia Tech and the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, working from fault behavior data, soil science, and modern structural engineering vulnerability assessments. The numbers they produce for a magnitude 7.7 earthquake: nearly 86,000 casualties, including 3,500 fatalities, 715,000 damaged buildings, 7.2 million people displaced, 2 million people seeking emergency shelter, direct economic losses of nearly $300 billion across 8 states, with indirect losses potentially twice that amount. Roughly 130 hospitals damaged. 15 major bridges unusable. Critical utility services disrupted across a region of 11 million people. These numbers are not projections from a single pessimistic model. They represent a consensus assessment from FEMA, the USGs, and the research community that has been studying the New Madrid seismic zone for decades. And the event that triggers them, a magnitude 7.7, is not the maximum possible event. It is not even the most extreme historical event. The earthquakes that struck the same zone in 1811 and 1812 are estimated by multiple research groups at magnitudes between 7 and 8.7. The sequence that is considered by the USGs to rank as some of the largest in United States history since European settlement produced the most extraordinary geological phenomena ever recorded in North America east of the Rocky Mountains. The fault is there. It has moved catastrophically before. The question that the monitoring data, including a specific event that occurred on April 23, 2026, has brought into sharp focus is whether and when it will move again. To understand what the New Madrid seismic zone is capable of, you have to start on the night of December 15, 1811. The settlement of New Madrid, Missouri, then part of the Louisiana Territory, sat on the west bank of the Mississippi River with approximately 1,000 residents, farmers, hunters, and fur traders who had made their lives along the Great River. The night of December 15th was winter quiet, the population asleep. At approximately 2 o'clock in the morning of December 16th, the ground began to move. What happened over the next several months was so geologically extreme that it remains, more than 2 centuries later, the reference event for every discussion of intraplate earthquake hazard in the United States. The first shock, now estimated at magnitude 7.2 to 8.2, estimates vary based on the historical accounts and modern geological evidence, was powerful enough to knock people off their feet across a region of hundreds of thousands of square miles. The shaking was felt as far away as Hartford, Connecticut. It awakened Dolly Madison at the White House in Washington, D.C. Reports arrived from as far as Charleston, South Carolina, and New Orleans, Louisiana. But the magnitude of the shaking was not the most extraordinary feature of the event. It was what the shaking did to the landscape. The earthquakes, 3 principal shocks on December 16th, January 23rd, and February 7th, with thousands of aftershocks spanning months, caused the ground to behave in ways that first-hand witnesses struggled to describe with the vocabulary available to them. Fissures opened in the earth, some described as hundreds of feet long, and erupted columns of water, sand, and a sulfurous liquid that witnesses reported smelling for days. Vast areas of land subsided by as much as 5 meters, flooding forests that were suddenly below the water table, and killing the trees that would stand as ghost forests, their dead trunks still visible in photographs over a century later. Other areas were uplifted. Reelfoot Lake in western Tennessee, 9,000 acres of water that now supports one of the most productive fisheries in the state, was created in a matter of minutes when the February 7th earthquake altered the topography of the St. Francis River drainage basin so dramatically that water flooded the newly subsided land, Lake St. Francis in eastern Arkansas, a body of water 64 kilometers long by 1 kilometer wide, was created by the same process of subsidence during the 1811 to 1812 sequence. The water level in the swampland adjacent to the St. Francis River reportedly rose 8 to 9 meters. The Mississippi River's banks collapsed across hundreds of miles of frontage, hurling enormous quantities of material, trees, soil, the physical substance of the riverbanks themselves, into the current. And then, on February 7, 1812, the most violent of the 3 principal earthquakes occurred. One of the earthquake-induced faults crossed the Mississippi River at 3 points. The uplift of the riverbed created a temporary obstruction to the river's flow. The water piled up behind the constriction. And then, as witnesses including boat captains on the river that night recorded in their journals, the river ran backward. The USG's summary of the event is measured in its language but precise in its consequences. One such uplift related to faulting near New Madrid, Missouri, temporarily forced the Mississippi River to flow backwards. The damage covered 600,000 square kilometers. The area over which the shaking was perceptible, felt however lightly by people who had never experienced an earthquake, covered 5 million square kilometers. The USG's notes that these earthquakes rank as some of the largest in the United States since European settlement. They were, by a substantial margin, the largest east of the Rocky Mountains in both the United States and Canada. The eyewitness accounts that survive from the 1811 to 1812 sequence have a quality that modern seismic instrumental data can quantify but cannot fully convey. A boat captain on the Mississippi River on the night of December 16th described the experience of watching the perpendicular banks above and below his vessel begin to fall into the river in such vast masses as nearly to sink our boat by the swell they occasioned. Another account described trees snapping in two, not from wind but from the ground motion itself, the trunks not breaking at the crown but at the base, as the earth beneath them moved in directions the root systems could not accommodate. Reports from across the Tennessee and Kentucky backcountry described sulfurous smells rising from fissures in the ground, water erupting from cracks in the soil, and a pervasive rolling of the earth that continued for minutes at a time. The February 7th event, the largest of the 3 principal shocks, struck at 3:45 in the morning, when the small population of the settlement was asleep. The town of New Madrid was destroyed. The shock was powerful enough to damage homes and topple chimneys in St. Louis, 160 miles away. It was felt at the president's house in Washington, where Dolly Madison was awakened by the trembling. The series of earthquakes that began on December 16, 1811, and continued in diminishing aftershocks through 1817, produced the most sustained alteration of landscape through seismic activity in the recorded history of North America. In 1811, the population of the Mississippi River Valley was sparse. The settlement of New Madrid had 1,000 people. Memphis did not yet exist in its modern form. St. Louis was a small trading post. The death toll, not precisely known but probably in the dozens to low hundreds, reflected the almost complete absence of population density in the most severely affected area. That is no longer the case. And the difference between the 1811 reality and the 2026 reality is precisely what makes the New Madrid seismic zone one of the most critical underexamined hazards in the United States. The New Madrid seismic zone does not look like a fault system from the surface. There is no escarpment, no obvious topographic feature, no visible crack in the earth that a traveler crossing the Mississippi River Valley would recognize as a geological boundary. The land is flat, the extraordinarily flat floodplain of one of the world's largest river systems, covered in agricultural fields and small towns and the ordinary landscape of the American interior. Below the surface, the geology is anything but ordinary. The fault system responsible for New Madrid seismicity is built on what geologists call the Real Foot Rift, an ancient failed rift zone that formed approximately 500 to 600 million years ago when the North American continent began to tear itself apart and then, for reasons that remain the subject of scientific discussion, stopped. The tear that became the Real Foot Rift produced a roughly north-south band of crustal weakness, 50 to 100 kilometers wide, running from northeastern Arkansas through the Missouri Bootheel and into southern Illinois. This zone of weakness, ancient, deep, and buried under hundreds of millions of years of subsequent sediment deposition, represents a fundamental heterogeneity in the North American plate, a place where the crust is thinner, weaker, and less capable of uniformly transmitting the tectonic stresses that the plate boundary forces impose from both the east and the west. The New Madrid seismic zone is what happens when modern tectonic stress encounters ancient crustal weakness. The specific faults are identified by the seismological community as the Real Foot Fault, the Cottonwood Grove Fault, and the New Madrid North Fault. Three structures that together define a seismicity pattern shaped roughly like a Z when plotted on a map, running approximately 300 kilometers from northeastern Arkansas through southeastern Missouri. The Real Foot Fault crosses the Mississippi River 3 times, which is why the February 7, 1812 earthquake produced the river reversal phenomenon. Each of these faults is buried under thick sediments. None of them is visible at the surface without extensive drilling, seismic imaging, or the paleoseismic evidence preserved in the earthquake-induced sand blows scattered across the floodplain. The tectonic mechanism driving the New Madrid system is the subject of ongoing scientific research and some genuine debate. The prevailing explanation, developed by researchers at the Center for Earthquake Research and Information at the University of Memphis, which operates the primary regional seismic monitoring network, is that far-field tectonic stresses, generated by the slow push of the Mid-Atlantic Ridge and the pull of subducting plates along the Pacific margin, are transmitted through the interior of the North American plate and concentrated in the zone of weakened, rifted crust. The mechanism is analogous to repeatedly bending a metal bar. The crack that eventually forms is not at the point of maximum applied force, but at the existing flaw, the inclusion, the notch, the material heterogeneity, where stress concentrates. The zone also produces a continuous, low-level background seismicity that is the clearest operational evidence that the fault system is not dormant. The Center for Earthquake Research and Information reports approximately 200 earthquakes per year detected within the zone by the Regional Monitoring Network, most too small to be felt by humans, but all representing the expression of ongoing tectonic stress within the fault system. The USGS operates and supports networks in the region that are specifically designed to detect and locate these small events, because the pattern of microseismicity provides the most direct observational evidence available for where the fault system is currently active and how it is behaving. And then there is what sits directly on top of all of this. The Mississippi embayment, the geological term for the broad trough of the Mississippi River Valley, is filled with one of the most extensive deposits of loose, water-saturated sediment in North America. The upper 30 meters of sediment within the embayment include sand, silt, and clay deposited by the Mississippi, Ohio, St. Francis, and White Rivers and their tributaries over the past 60,000 years. Below that are older river sediments and marine sedimentary rocks extending downward through hundreds of meters, before reaching the ancient Paleozoic bedrock. At Memphis, the bedrock is approximately 3,000 feet, nearly 1 kilometer, below the surface. This is the fact that most clearly distinguishes Memphis' seismic vulnerability from any city in California. In Los Angeles, bedrock is typically accessible within meters to tens of meters. In San Francisco, it is often within 30 to 50 meters. The difference is not merely geological, it is operational. Earthquake energy that travels through loose sediment is amplified, sometimes dramatically amplified, compared to the same energy traveling through solid rock. The mathematical relationship between sediment depth and shaking amplification is well established in seismic engineering. Memphis, sitting atop nearly a kilometer of soft water-saturated sediment directly above an active fault system, faces a shaking amplification problem that California cities do not. On April 23, 2026, at 11:59 in the morning local time, a magnitude 4.0 earthquake struck the ground approximately 1 kilometer northwest of Cooter, Missouri, a small town in Pemiscot County in Missouri's Bootheel region, about 80 miles north of Memphis and close to the Missouri-Arkansas state line. The earthquake was felt across several states. The shaking reached Memphis. It was widely reported because, as Nathan Moran, a research scientist with the Center for Earthquake Research and Information at the University of Memphis, told the regional news outlet KFVS 12, "It's the strongest earthquake we've had in several years in the New Madrid zone proper." That characterization matters. The New Madrid zone produces occasional earthquakes of magnitude 3 to 4 and hundreds of smaller events per year. But the April 23rd event was notable not only for its magnitude but for its location, squarely within the core of the seismic network's instrumented area, rather than on the periphery where smaller events more commonly occur. Moran noted the scientific significance explicitly. "We've had earthquakes on the periphery. We have earthquakes in other places where our instruments feel them. But to have an earthquake of that magnitude within the system, within all our instrumentation, is something that we can use to harvest that data for a better understanding of the seismic zone." More significant than the single earthquake was the context it arrived in. According to the U.S. GES, there had been 20 earthquakes in the New Madrid seismic zone in just the 3 weeks preceding the April 23rd event. The April total ultimately reached 28 confirmed events by month's end, according to the U.S. GES data. The report from WSEU noted that the 4.0 was the strongest quake in the region since 2005, making it the largest event within the zone proper in more than 20 years. Nathan Moran was appropriately measured in his public comments. As for whether this signals something bigger, Moran said the risk remains low. But he said the earthquake should serve as a reminder that the heartland is located on an active seismic zone. He recommended normal emergency preparedness measures rather than specific elevated concern about imminent larger events. The scientific consensus is that individual microseismic events and moderate earthquakes in the New Madrid zone do not by themselves indicate elevated short-term rupture probability. The NMZ produces activity constantly, and a magnitude 4 earthquake is not a reliable precursor to a major event. But the April 23rd event is relevant to this investigation for a different reason than short-term prediction. It is a data point in the broader story of an active fault system operating in a region where the population's awareness, the built environment's preparation, and the emergency management infrastructure are not calibrated to the risk the monitoring data consistently demonstrates. The April event was felt across Missouri, Arkansas, Tennessee, Kentucky, and Illinois. It caused no damage, but it demonstrated 3 important things. First, that the zone is active, not dormant, not shutting down, not a relic of a geological past that no longer applies. Second, that the bedrock geology of the Midwest causes seismic energy to travel remarkable distances even from relatively modest events. A magnitude 4.0 in the New Madrid zone that can be felt 50 to 100 miles away illustrates precisely why a magnitude 7 or 8 would not be a regional disaster in the conventional sense, but a multi-state catastrophe. Third, that the monitoring infrastructure, the Center for Earthquake Research and Information's network at the University of Memphis, the USG's Advanced National Seismic System, the dense instrumentation throughout the zone, is capturing and analyzing every event, building the data record that researchers need to improve their understanding of the fault's current behavior. What the April event cannot tell us, what no single seismic event can tell us about an intraplate fault system, is when the next major rupture will occur. That question requires engaging with the full scope of the scientific evidence, including the paleoseismic record, the GPS geodetic data, and the ongoing debate about what the zone's current behavior actually implies for future hazard. That debate is one of the most interesting and consequential in American geophysics, and it is what the next part of this investigation examines. There is a genuine, active, substantive scientific debate about the New Madrid seismic zone that has been conducted in peer-reviewed literature and at scientific workshops for over a decade, and that almost never reaches public consciousness, even though its stakes are significant. The debate centers on a specific and important question: is the New Madrid seismic zone currently accumulating the stress that would be necessary for a repeat of the 1811 to 1812 sequence, Or is the zone in a quieter phase, either temporarily or permanently, in which large earthquakes are unlikely to recur on the timescale that the paleoseismic record has suggested? The case for reduced hazard is made most systematically by Seth Stein, a geophysicist at Northwestern University, and colleagues who have published extensively on GPS geodetic measurements across the zone. Their argument: GPS measurements show less than 0.2 millimeters per year of surface deformation across the New Madrid fault system, far below what would be expected if stress were accumulating at a rate consistent with magnitude 7 to 8 earthquakes every few hundred years. If the fault is not measurably straining, they argue, either the stress is not accumulating or the GPS instruments are not capable of detecting the accumulation that is present. Their interpretation of this data is that the 1811 to 1812 earthquakes may have been a temporary cluster, a burst of activity that released ancient stress that had been building for thousands of years, and that is unlikely to repeat on a short human timescale. The case for ongoing hazard is made by the USGs, the Center for Earthquake Research and Information at the University of Memphis, and a broad consensus of geophysicists who study the paleoseismic record, the evidence of prehistoric earthquakes preserved in the geological record across the Mississippi embayment. That evidence includes sand blows, the surface features produced by liquefaction during major earthquakes, that have been dated using radiocarbon and other techniques to approximately 900 years ago and approximately 1550 years ago, in addition to the 1811 to 1812 sequence. The time between these events averages approximately 500 years, with a range of 200 to 800 years depending on how the uncertainty in the dating is resolved. The USGs convened a workshop of experts in 2006 specifically to evaluate the GPS data and its implications for the national seismic hazard maps. The workshop conclusion was that the GPS data was not a convincing reason to lower the assessed hazard, because the paleoseismic evidence for repeated large earthquakes was robust, and the GPS measurement methodology might not be sensitive to the type of stress accumulation operating in this system. The USG's fact sheet published in 2009, titled "Earthquake Hazard in the New Madrid Seismic Zone Remains a Concern," restates the broad scientific consensus. There is continuing concern for a major destructive earthquake. Structures in Memphis, St. Louis, and other communities are vulnerable, and the assessment is based on decades of research by dozens of federal, university, state, and consulting earth scientists. The current official probability estimate from the USGs, approximately a 7 to 10% chance of a magnitude 7 or greater earthquake in the New Madrid region within the next 50 years. The probability of a magnitude 6 or greater, approximately 25 to 40% over 50 years. These are not negligible numbers. For comparison, the USG's Uniform California Earthquake Rupture Forecast estimates a 93% probability of a magnitude 6.7 or greater earthquake in Southern California within 30 years. The New Madrid probabilities are lower, substantially lower, than California's, but they are also substantially higher than zero. And a magnitude 7 or greater earthquake in the New Madrid zone, striking a region without California's seismic preparedness infrastructure, would produce consequences that dwarf what a comparable earthquake produces in California. One additional piece of scientific research adds an important dimension to the GPS-VES paleoseismology debate. The paper by Timothy Craig, Christelle Channard, and Eric Calais, three geophysicists at the University of Leeds, the University of Lausanne, and the École Normale Supérieure, published in Nature Communications in December of 2017, examined the microseismicity of the New Madrid zone at both annual and multi-annual timescales. Their finding was remarkable. The rate of small earthquakes in the zone varies in synchrony with hydrological loading, specifically with changes in the amount of water stored in the upper Mississippi River basin. When the water table rises after heavy rains or snowmelt, the increased weight of water pressing on the crust induces small but measurable changes in the stress state of the rock. And those stress changes, the paper documented, correlate with measurable changes in the rate of microearthquakes in the New Madrid zone. The significance of this finding for the GPS debate is specific. If the New Madrid fault system is so sensitive to stress, changes as small as those produced by seasonal variations in water weight, it is a fault system that operates very close to the threshold of failure. A fault that responds to seasonal hydrological loading with detectable changes in seismicity rate is not a fault that requires large continuous GPS observable strain accumulation to eventually rupture. It is a fault that may be perpetually near the edge, its stress state modulated by every rain event, every drought, every seasonal flood, and that may ultimately be pushed past its rupture threshold by a perturbation that no instrument would have identified in advance as the critical trigger.
The April 23, 2026 event does not resolve this scientific debate. It does not constitute evidence that a major rupture is imminent. What it does is confirm that the zone is active, that the fault system is not inert, that it is processing whatever stress it carries by releasing it in small events, and that the infrastructure and research community monitoring it has the tools to learn from every event it produces.
The single most dangerous physical consequence of a major New Madrid earthquake is not the shaking itself. It is what the shaking does to the ground. Soil liquefaction, earthquake-induced liquefaction, is a physical transformation that occurs when seismic waves pass through saturated, loosely packed sand deposits. The process has a precise mechanism, documented in USG's technical literature and in the engineering analysis that underlies every building code's seismic provisions. Under normal conditions, sand grains are in contact with each other, transmitting load through grain-to-grain contact. The water filling the spaces between grains, the pore water, is at normal hydrostatic pressure. The sand's load-bearing capacity is a function of the friction between its grains, which is in turn a function of the normal stress between them. When seismic waves pass through water-saturated sand, they cause rapid, repeated deformation of the soil. This rapid deformation transfers load from grain-to-grain contacts to the pore water. The pore water pressure rises. As the USGS describes it directly, if the pore water pressure increases to the point that it equals the weight of the overlying soil, the sediment liquefies and behaves as a fluid. The grain-to-grain contact stress drops to zero. The sand's load-bearing capacity disappears. The material that had been solid ground, supporting buildings, roads, pipelines, and bridges, becomes, for the duration of the shaking, and sometimes for hours or days afterward, a slurry of water and sediment. A building sitting on liquefied soil does not tip over in the Hollywood sense. It sinks, it tilts. In some cases, it rotates. The building itself may not be structurally damaged by the seismic waves. It may simply settle into the ground as its foundation's bearing capacity vanishes beneath it. The Niigata earthquake in Japan in 1964 produced iconic photographs of apartment buildings tilted at 45-degree angles in perfectly intact structural condition. The buildings had not collapsed. They had been deposited sideways as their foundations followed the slope of the liquefied material. The evidence for widespread liquefaction during the 1811 to 1812 earthquakes is extensive and preserved across hundreds of sites throughout the Mississippi embayment. The most visible evidence is sand blows. The surface features formed when liquefied sand and water erupt from below through cracks and weaknesses in the overlying soil, creating mounds of sand that can range from centimeters to meters in diameter, and that persist in the agricultural landscape for generations. The USGS has documented sand blows at more than 250 sites across the New Madrid region, representing the liquefaction features from the historic 1811 to 1812 events. Prehistoric sand blows, representing the events around 900 AD and 1450 AD, have been identified at dozens of additional sites. The Mississippi embayment sediment profile is the worst possible combination of variables for liquefaction. The upper 30 meters, the zone most susceptible to liquefaction triggering, consists of sand, silt, and clay deposited by major rivers over the past 60,000 years. These sediments are water-saturated because the water table in the Mississippi River floodplain is typically within meters of the surface. They are loosely packed alluvial deposits rather than the consolidated, compacted sediments that resist liquefaction. And they are extensive, covering hundreds of thousands of square kilometers of the most economically critical infrastructure corridor in the United States. The 1811 to 1812 earthquakes produced exactly the kind of massive, widespread liquefaction that the modern scientific analysis predicts for a major repeat event. The sand blows that formed across the Mississippi River floodplain during those earthquakes were so extensive that they were described in historical accounts as turning vast areas of farmland into sandy desert. The agricultural soil replaced by sand erupted from below that rendered the ground unfarable for years. The USGS has mapped over 250 sand blow sites from the historic 1811 to 1812 sequence. The prehistoric sand blows from the approximately 900 AD and 1450 AD. Events are present at dozens of additional sites, confirming that the liquefaction pattern was not unique to the 1811 to 1812 sequence, but is the characteristic consequence of major New Madrid earthquakes. What made the 1811 to 1812 liquefaction devastating to the relatively sparse agricultural population of the time would be catastrophic to the dense urban population of modern Memphis and the surrounding region. A sand blow that destroys a farm field is a significant economic loss, but a manageable one. The same liquefaction process occurring beneath a neighborhood of houses, a commercial district, a hospital, or a major bridge abutment is a structural failure event. The ground that was supporting the structure is no longer solid. The structure, regardless of its own engineering quality, has lost its foundation. The Holocene alluvial deposits associated with the floodplains of major rivers in the area have the greatest potential for liquefaction, according to the probabilistic seismic and liquefaction hazard analysis of the Mississippi embayment published in the academic literature. The maps generated by these analyses show that the floodplain environments most susceptible to liquefaction are precisely the environments where the highest concentrations of infrastructure, the levees, the bridges, the pipelines, the roads, are located. The infrastructure consequences of widespread liquefaction in the Mississippi Valley are not difficult to calculate in general terms. They are also not widely understood because the public mental model of earthquake damage is anchored to images from California, cracked roads, collapsed overpasses, damaged buildings that do not capture what liquefaction adds to the picture. California's earthquake-damaged infrastructure typically fails because the ground shakes it to failure. The structures crack, the supports buckle, the connections fail under the forces of ground motion. Repair involves rebuilding the damaged structure on ground that, after the shaking stops, is once again solid. The foundation is intact. The problem is the structure. In a major New Madrid earthquake scenario, the problem is both the structure and the foundation. The liquefied ground cannot support the structure even if the structure itself has survived the shaking intact. A highway bridge whose piers are founded in liquefied sediment will settle and tilt as the liquefied material flows laterally away from beneath the foundations. A process called lateral spreading, which the USGS documents as a consequence of liquefaction, in which overlying soil, floating on liquefied sediments, moves down even gentle slopes, causing fissuring and lateral and vertical displacement. The Mississippi River bridges represent the most acute single infrastructure vulnerability in the New Madrid scenario. The FEMA scenario for a magnitude 7.7 earthquake identifies roughly 15 major bridges as unusable in the immediate aftermath of the event. The bridges that cross the Mississippi River in the impact zone, carrying Interstate 40 at Memphis, Interstate 55 at Memphis, the railroad bridges that carry transcontinental freight traffic, the Interstate 55 bridge at Caruthersville, are structures founded in the alluvial sediments of the river's floodplain. Most were not designed to the seismic standards that would be applied to new construction in the region today. Some predate modern seismic engineering entirely. The consequence of major bridge failures on the Mississippi River is not merely regional. The Mississippi River is, as the previous Signal Watch investigation on the river's drought conditions documented, the most critical freight corridor in the Western Hemisphere. The bridges that span it at Memphis and at points north and south are the connectors between the eastern and western road and rail networks of the United States. If those bridges fail simultaneously, the functional separation of the country's transportation network, east of the Mississippi and west of the Mississippi, becomes a logistical reality that no emergency response framework has been designed to manage. Natural gas infrastructure presents a parallel vulnerability. The transcontinental natural gas pipeline network that crosses the Mississippi River Valley was engineered to specific soil movement tolerances that a major liquefaction event would exceed. A buried pipeline crossing from solid ground on one bank to liquefied ground on the other, or crossing floodplain sediments that liquefy differentially at different points along its path, faces differential settlement loads that can shear the pipe. A sheared major natural gas transmission line in the vicinity of a major earthquake, with broken gas lines inside damaged buildings, providing ignition sources throughout the affected area, creates a secondary fire hazard that the FEMA scenario documents as a significant multiplier of total damage and casualties. The water distribution systems of the major cities in the impact zone face the same differential settlement problem on a neighborhood-by-neighborhood scale. The water mains that supply Memphis, St. Louis, Little Rock, and other cities cross floodplain sediments of varying liquefaction susceptibility. Breaks in water mains during major earthquakes are the rule rather than the exception in high liquefaction environments, documented extensively in Japan and New Zealand following their major liquefaction events. Broken water mains are not merely a public health problem in the days after a disaster. They directly compromise fire suppression. The fire hydrants lose pressure, fire trucks cannot fill their tanks, and the fires that start when the earthquake shakes gas appliances off of their connections and damages electrical infrastructure cannot be controlled. The Department of the Interior's testimony to Congress on New Madrid seismic zone hazard included a direct statement. At least one highway and one railroad bridge crossing the Mississippi River are unlikely to survive a major New Madrid earthquake, and many old overpasses would likely collapse. The SG's documentation for the Department of the Interior adds that lifelines crossing the region, including highways, bridges, and oil and gas pipelines leading to the northeastern United States, would be severely damaged. The vulnerability of the built environment in the New Madrid impact zone is, in a specific technical sense, much worse than California's, and it is worse precisely because the region has spent 2 centuries believing it was not at risk. Unreinforced masonry construction, the brick buildings, the older commercial blocks, the legacy institutional buildings built before modern seismic codes, is the most vulnerable category of building in any earthquake. Unreinforced masonry fails because the mortar between the bricks has no ductility. It cannot flex under the dynamic loads of ground shaking. When the ground moves, the masonry walls crack, the connections between walls and floors fail, and the roof can collapse inward or the walls can fall outward. In California, unreinforced masonry buildings have been systematically identified, regulated, and in many cities mandated for retrofit or demolition since the 1989 Loma Prieta earthquake, which demonstrated the catastrophic performance of this building type in vivid detail when buildings in San Francisco's Marina District collapsed. In the Midwest, no equivalent mandatory retrofit program has been systematically implemented. The FEMA scenario projects that 60% or more of Memphis's unreinforced masonry buildings could collapse or be rendered uninhabitable by a major New Madrid earthquake. The Department of Interior's congressional testimony noted directly that Memphis has an aging infrastructure and many of its large buildings, including unreinforced schools and fire and police stations, are particularly fragile when subjected to severe ground shaking. Very few buildings were built using modern building codes that have some provision for seismic-resistant design. This is not a criticism of Memphis specifically. It is a description of the built environment that was constructed in a region that, for most of its history, had no strong scientific basis for seismic design requirements and no political pressure to implement them. Tennessee adopted the International Building Code with seismic provisions statewide in 2004. That adoption was both later than California's equivalent provisions and less uniformly enforced, with significant gaps in rural counties. Missouri, Arkansas, Kentucky, and Illinois have adopted seismic provisions in some areas, but with inconsistent implementation across their building stock. The result is that the legacy building stock in the New Madrid impact zone, the brick commercial buildings of Memphis's downtown, the masonry school buildings, the older hospital facilities, the bridge abutments, and retaining walls built to pre-seismic design standards, represents a concentrated structural vulnerability that cannot be quickly remediated. Earthquake retrofitting is expensive, technically complex, and disruptive to ongoing building operations. It requires sustained political will and sustained funding that the region has not mobilized, partly because the earthquake risk has not been as visible or as frequently demonstrated as California's. The FEMA projection of 3,500 fatalities for a 2 a.m. event when the population is home, asleep, indoors, and a dramatically different number for a daytime event reflects precisely this building stock vulnerability. At 2 a.m., people are in residential buildings, which in the United States tend to be lighter wood frame construction that performs better in earthquakes than masonry. During the day, they are in the commercial, institutional, and school buildings that represent the highest structural risk. There is one additional physical dimension of the New Madrid earthquake threat that makes direct comparison to California scenarios misleading, and that the engineering and seismological literature has been documenting with increasing precision over the past 2 decades. Seismic waves are not uniform. When they travel from the rupturing fault upward through the earth to the surface, their character is modified by the material they pass through. The frequency content changes, the amplitude changes, the duration changes, and the specific nature of those changes depends critically on the geological path the waves travel. In California, many earthquake scenarios involve waves traveling through granite, the ancient, dense, hard rock of the Sierra Nevada and the peninsular ranges, to the surface. Granite transmits high-frequency seismic energy efficiently, attenuates low-frequency energy, and does not amplify shaking significantly relative to the source. The shaking at a California site underlain by granite is more or less proportional to the source energy of the earthquake. In the Mississippi embayment, seismic waves from a New Madrid rupture travel upward through thousands of feet of loose, water-saturated sediment before reaching the surface. Soft sediments have a specific effect on seismic wave propagation. They amplify low-frequency, long-period energy, the kind of energy that causes tall buildings and long structures like bridges to sway resonantly, and they trap energy, causing the shaking to last longer than it would over bedrock. The technical term for this effect is site amplification, and it has been quantified through detailed ground motion studies for the Memphis and St. Louis areas. The research conducted at the Center for Earthquake Research and Information and documented in the probabilistic seismic hazard analyses of the Mississippi embayment finds that ground motions at Memphis from a major New Madrid earthquake would be significantly amplified compared to what would be expected over bedrock, potentially by factors of 2 to 5, depending on frequency, for the most susceptible soft sediment sites. The updated Memphis urban seismic hazard maps produced in the 2012 to 2013 research program found a significant increase in hazard compared to the 2004 maps, specifically due to improved modeling of the three-dimensional geologic structure and its effect on ground motion amplification. This amplification effect has a specific consequence for the type of structural damage that Memphis and other Mississippi Valley cities would experience. The amplified long-period shaking affects tall structures most severely. The taller the building, the lower its natural frequency, and the more efficiently the long-period energy couples into resonant motion. A well-built 10-story reinforced concrete building might survive the peak short-period ground motion from a New Madrid earthquake with limited damage, while simultaneously experiencing dangerous resonant amplification of the long-period components that cause story-to-story drift. The relative horizontal displacement between floors that strains connections and breaks non-structural elements. The same amplification effect applies to the long, linear infrastructure of bridges. The Mississippi River crossings, which span hundreds of meters horizontally, have natural frequencies that fall in the range most amplified by the soft sediment column. A bridge that would survive the ground motion as transmitted through bedrock might experience resonant amplification that causes the deck displacement at midspan to exceed its design limits. Not because the earthquake is more powerful than the bridge was designed for, but because the transmission medium between the earthquake and the bridge has amplified the specific frequencies to which the bridge is most sensitive. California has seismic building codes that were specifically written to account for amplification effects at sites with soft sediment, partly because San Francisco's Marina District, which was built on artificial fill over a bay, demonstrated catastrophically in 1989 that soft ground amplifies earthquake damage. The Midwest's building codes have been slower to incorporate site-specific amplification effects into design requirements, and the existing building stock predates any such requirements. And this is where the story takes the turn that most discussions of the New Madrid seismic zone avoid, a direct engagement with the hardest question the data raises. The New Madrid seismic zone has produced, over the past several thousand years, at least 3 sequences of very large earthquakes. At approximately 900 AD, approximately 1450 AD, and 1811 to 1812, separated by intervals averaging 500 years, with uncertainty ranging from 200 to 800 years. We are now 215 years past the most recent sequence. By the lower bound of the uncertainty range, the zone could have another major rupture within decades. By the upper bound, it might not occur for several more centuries. The GPS data that Seth Stein and colleagues at Northwestern University have published suggests that surface strain accumulation is currently below the detection threshold of the measurement system. Less than 0.2 millimeters per year of deformation across the fault zone. If the fault system is not straining at a measurable rate, how is it going to produce another major earthquake? This is the key question Stein's research has pressed, and it is a genuinely important one. The USSGs and SERI counter this by noting that intraplate seismic zones behave differently from plate boundary faults. At plate boundaries like the San Andreas, the continuous relative motion of 2 plates produces continuous strain accumulation that GPS detects easily, tens of millimeters per year of slip building toward eventual earthquake rupture. At the New Madrid zone, the far-field stress driving the system is orders of magnitude smaller, and the stress may be concentrated at depth in ways that surface GPS cannot resolve. The paper by Timothy Craig, Christel Channard, and Eric Calais, published in Nature Communications in 2017, showed that even small stress changes from hydrological loading, the weight of water on the Earth's surface varying seasonally, can produce detectable variations in the microseismicity rate of the New Madrid zone, demonstrating that the seismicity is sensitive to stress perturbations at the level of a few kilopascals. A fault system that is this close to a critical stress threshold for small events may be significantly closer to the threshold for large events than the GPS data alone would suggest. What neither side of this debate can do, with current technology, with current understanding of intraplate fault mechanics, is predict when a major rupture will occur. The paleoseismic record tells us that it has occurred approximately every 500 years over the past few thousand years. It does not tell us whether we are at year 200 of a 200-year interval or year 200 of an 800-year interval. The physics of how intraplate stress concentrates and releases is not understood at the precision needed to project recurrence timing with meaningful accuracy.
What this uncertainty demands is not false precision in either direction. It demands the kind of honest risk management that FEMA attempted to quantify, knowing that the probability of a major event within 50 years is real, that the consequences, if it occurs, are catastrophic, and that the preparation deficit between what the region has and what the consequences require is enormous. The uncertainty about timing does not reduce the case for preparation. It amplifies it.
Memphis, Tennessee sits at the geographic intersection of the most threatening combination of factors in the New Madrid scenario: proximity to the fault, maximum sediment depth, maximum liquefaction susceptibility, and minimum earthquake preparedness relative to California cities of comparable size. The metropolitan area's population is approximately 1.3 million. The bedrock is approximately 3,000 feet below the surface, one of the deepest sediment columns of any major U.S. city, comparable to the most deeply buried sites that produce the most severe amplification effects in engineering studies of the embayment. The city's built environment includes a substantial inventory of the pre-seismic code masonry construction that the FEMA scenario identifies as the highest casualty building category. The FEMA scenario specifically projects that 60% or more of Memphis's unreinforced masonry buildings could collapse or be rendered uninhabitable. These buildings include not only private residential and commercial structures, but specific critical facilities, fire and police stations that emergency responders would need to operate from in the immediate aftermath of the disaster, schools where children would be during a daytime event, and hospital buildings that would need to receive the casualties the event produces. The USCI's Department of Interior documentation states explicitly that many of its large buildings, including unreinforced schools and fire and police stations, are particularly fragile when subjected to severe ground shaking. A fire station that collapses or is severely damaged in a major earthquake is not merely a building loss. It is the loss of the local fire suppression capacity that would be needed to fight the secondary fires, the gas line fires, the electrical fires, the heating system fires that follow major structural damage across a wide area. A police station that collapses is the loss of the emergency coordination capacity that would be needed to manage the response. A hospital that is damaged beyond use is the loss of the medical capacity that would be needed to receive the casualties from its own collapse and from the building collapses in its surrounding neighborhood. The liquefaction maps produced through Memphis urban seismic hazard mapping programs show that the neighborhoods with the highest liquefaction potential are concentrated in the low-lying areas near the Mississippi River and its tributaries, the same areas where historically the highest concentrations of lower-income population have lived, in older housing stock with the lowest structural quality. The overlap between the physical vulnerability map, the building stock vulnerability map, and the social vulnerability map in Memphis creates a compound inequality that earthquake scientists have documented for other cities, but that remains largely invisible in Memphis's public discourse about urban resilience. The FedEx Global Hub at Memphis International Airport represents a specific economic vulnerability that extends far beyond the metropolitan area. Memphis is one of the most important logistics nodes in the United States, the global hub for FedEx's overnight express delivery system, a major hub for UPS and other carriers, and a critical waypoint for the transcontinental freight network. The airport and its associated logistics infrastructure is built on the alluvial sediments of the Mississippi River floodplain. A major earthquake that disrupts Memphis's logistics infrastructure would produce supply chain consequences affecting every sector of the American economy, not in the abstract sense of economic disruption, but in the immediate operational sense of medical supplies not reaching hospitals, automotive parts not reaching assembly lines, and perishable goods not reaching distribution centers across the eastern half of the country. The levee system that protects Memphis and the surrounding lowlands from Mississippi River flooding represents an additional vulnerability dimension that the earthquake scenario adds to the flood risk that already exists. Major levees in the Mississippi River Valley were not designed to survive major seismic events. A levee built on liquefiable river sediment is itself vulnerable to the liquefaction process. The levee body and its foundation can both liquefy during strong shaking, causing the levee to slump and potentially fail. If a major earthquake were to occur during a period of high river stage, as would have been the case in spring of any year with significant snowmelt, The simultaneous failure of levee protection and the generation of the surge from the earthquake's riverbed dynamics would expose the low-lying communities behind the levees to both seismic damage and flooding simultaneously. The Arkansas Department of Public Safety documentation of the New Madrid hazard notes explicitly: if the earthquakes were to occur when the Ohio and Mississippi rivers were high, loss of levees would be likely, along with flooding of low-lying communities. The compound disaster scenario, major earthquake plus levee failure plus river flooding, is not a tail risk extreme case. It is the operational planning assumption for a spring or early summer event when the rivers are running high. The social vulnerability dimension of Memphis's earthquake exposure amplifies every other physical vulnerability. The earthquake engineers and urban geographers who study disaster outcomes have consistently documented that natural disasters impose their worst consequences on populations with the fewest resources to prepare for, respond to, and recover from extreme events. In Memphis, as in other major American cities, the neighborhoods with the oldest housing stock, the lowest incomes, the highest rates of renter occupancy, and the least access to emergency communications are concentrated in the areas with the highest ground shaking and liquefaction susceptibility. The people least equipped to survive a major earthquake are in many cases the people living on the worst ground. St. Louis, Missouri represents a different dimension of the New Madrid vulnerability profile. A larger city at a greater distance from the zone's core, with better average bedrock depth, but with specific geographic and building stock characteristics that make its exposure to a major event significant. The bedrock beneath downtown St. Louis is approximately 10 feet below the surface, dramatically shallower than Memphis, providing substantially better seismic ground conditions. Away from downtown, however, significant areas of St. Louis and its metropolitan area are underlain by the alluvial sediments of the Missouri and Mississippi rivers, where liquefaction risk is elevated and ground motion amplification is meaningful. The building stock of St. Louis reflects its history as one of the oldest major cities west of the Appalachians. The city's architectural heritage includes substantial quantities of 19th century and early 20th century masonry construction. The brick row houses, the commercial blocks, the older public buildings that were constructed without seismic design considerations in an era when seismic codes did not exist in Missouri. The Missouri State Emergency Management Agency assessment of a major New Madrid event identified that even counties at significant distance from the fault zone's core would experience structural damage rates of 1 to 10% of buildings with severe structural damage. The 1812 event produced documented damage in St. Louis. Many houses were severely damaged and their chimneys were thrown down, according to historical records. At that time, St. Louis was a trading post with a fraction of its current population and building stock. The same ground motion arriving today would encounter a city of approximately 2.8 million in the metropolitan area, with a mix of building types ranging from modern high-rise construction to the legacy masonry that the earthquakes of 1812 damaged. The Mississippi River crossing at St. Louis, the iconic Gateway Arch standing on the western bank, is a potential image of the New Madrid threat that exists in a very specific structural sense. The arch itself is an engineering marvel designed for significant wind loads and some seismic consideration. But the bridges immediately north and south of the arch that carry the Interstate 44 and Interstate 55 traffic, the critical Missouri River and Mississippi River crossings, are structures whose seismic performance in a major New Madrid event has been the subject of engineering concern. The natural gas pipeline network that crosses the Mississippi River Valley is one of the most critical infrastructure systems in the United States, and one of the least discussed in the context of New Madrid earthquake hazard. The major transcontinental natural gas transmission pipelines that traverse the Mississippi embayment represent a strategic asset whose disruption would create energy supply consequences far beyond the immediate earthquake impact zone. These pipelines carry natural gas from production regions in Texas, Oklahoma, and the Gulf of Mexico to distribution systems serving the northeastern United States, the Great Lakes region, and the Midwest. They cross the Mississippi River and the alluvial sediments of the Mississippi Valley at multiple locations. The failure mode for buried pipelines in liquefaction zones is differential settlement. The ground on one side of the pipe settles differently from the ground on the other side, creating bending loads that exceed the pipe's structural capacity and cause it to shear. In a major New Madrid event that produces widespread liquefaction across the Mississippi Valley, the probability of multiple pipeline failures is high. The Department of Interior testimony to Congress cited oil and gas pipelines leading to the northeastern United States as among the lifelines that would be severely damaged. A rupture in a major natural gas transmission line in the immediate vicinity of a major earthquake, with broken gas service lines inside thousands of damaged buildings throughout the impact zone, creates a fire risk scenario that the FEMA modeling has incorporated, but that is difficult to communicate because it is a compound consequence rather than a direct earthquake effect. The Northridge earthquake in California in 1994, the Kobe earthquake in Japan in 1995, and the Loma Prieta earthquake in 1989 all produced significant post-earthquake fire that killed people and destroyed property beyond what the initial shaking caused. The post-earthquake fire risk in the New Madrid scenario, where pipeline infrastructure is more vulnerable and fire suppression infrastructure is less seismically hardened than in California, is proportionally larger. The water supply systems of the major cities in the impact zone face both the immediate infrastructure failure risk and a longer-term contamination risk that would compound the disaster response. Memphis draws its drinking water from a well field in the Memphis Sands Aquifer, a deep sand aquifer underlying the city that provides some insulation from surface water quality issues. But the distribution system, the pipes that carry water from treatment facilities to homes, hospitals, and fire hydrants, is buried in the alluvial sediments that are most susceptible to liquefaction. Water main breaks during major earthquakes in soft sediment environments are nearly universal. Restoration of water distribution system pressure after widespread main breaks requires locating and repairing breaks one by one across a potentially devastated cityscape, a process that took weeks to months in comparable events. The New Madrid scenario modeling by the University of Illinois Mid-America Earthquake Center found that 3 days after a major event, 7.2 million people would still be displaced, and 2 million people would be seeking temporary shelter. Numbers driven not only by direct structural damage, but by the loss of utilities that renders occupied structures uninhabitable even when the buildings themselves have survived. Because a story of this scale and severity touches on real scientific debates, it is worth directly addressing two framings that circulate in the information environment and that deserve engagement rather than dismissal. The first is the claim that the New Madrid earthquake hazard is systematically overstated, that the scientific consensus behind the FEMA scenario numbers represents institutional capture by earthquake scientists who benefit from elevated hazard assessments, and that Seth Stein's GPS data demonstrating minimal strain accumulation has been suppressed or ignored in favor of a more alarming narrative. This framing gets the science backward. The GPS data has not been suppressed. It has been published in peer-reviewed journals, presented at scientific workshops, and formally considered in the USG's National Seismic Hazard Mapping process. The USG's worksheet explicitly acknowledges the GPS data and explains why the hazard assessment remains elevated despite it. The scientific disagreement between Stein and the USG's Kerry consensus is a real, ongoing, legitimate scientific debate. It is not a suppressed finding. And the outcome of that debate does not depend on anyone's funding. It depends on which physical model best explains the paleoseismic record, the GPS data, and the ongoing microseismicity, all of which are publicly available data. The second framing claims the opposite, that the New Madrid seismic zone is about to produce a catastrophic earthquake imminently, that the April 2026 microseismicity cluster signals the beginning of a rupture sequence similar to the 1811 to 1812 events, and that authorities are concealing the imminence of disaster to prevent panic. This claim is equally unsupported by the evidence. Nathan Moran of the Center for Earthquake Research and Information was explicit in his April 26 statement. The risk from the current activity remains low, and a single magnitude 4 earthquake does not indicate imminent major rupture. The MMZ produces hundreds of earthquakes per year, most below the threshold of human perception. The April cluster of 28 events in a month is elevated compared to the long-term average.
What the evidence actually supports is the middle position, a fault system with a documented history of producing magnitude 7 to 8 earthquakes at roughly 500-year intervals, currently 215 years past its most recent large sequence, sitting beneath an infrastructure and population that is not prepared for the consequences of a major rupture, with genuine scientific uncertainty about the current state of stress accumulation and the timing of the next event. That position is alarming without being alarmist. It is uncertain without being dismissive. And it is the position that the USGS, FEMA, and the research community that studies this zone most carefully have consistently articulated.
The honest assessment of what the New Madrid seismic zone means for the people living within its impact radius requires presenting 3 interpretations of the evidence, presented fairly, with the supporting evidence for each stated honestly. Interpretation 1, the reduced hazard case. The GPS data is telling us something real and important. The New Madrid seismic zone is not currently accumulating strain at a rate consistent with the pre-1811-12 period. The 1811 to 1812 earthquakes may have been a cluster event, an unusual concentration of seismic activity that represented the episodic release of ancient, slowly accumulating stress rather than the regular operation of a currently loaded fault. Under this interpretation, a major repeat of 1811 to 1812 is centuries away at minimum, and the current level of investment in New Madrid preparedness may be disproportionate to the actual near-term risk. Seth Stein's framework would suggest that the money spent on earthquake preparedness in the New Madrid zone would be better invested in hazards that are demonstrably building today. This interpretation has genuine supporting evidence. The GPS measurements are real, the strain deficit is real, and the physical intuition that a fault not currently straining cannot be immediately threatening to rupture is not obviously wrong. The uncertainty in the paleoseismic dating is genuine. The 200 to 800 year range for the recurrence interval means we could be far from the next major event. Some seismologists have found the argument for a cluster event model persuasive. Interpretation 2, the ongoing hazard case. The paleoseismic record is the most reliable evidence available for fault behavior over timescales relevant to earthquake recurrence, and it shows approximately 3 events in the past 1,500 years. The GPS data may simply be failing to detect the accumulation mechanism operating in this intraplate system, where the driving forces are far smaller and the accumulation timescales far longer than at plate boundaries. The continuous background seismicity, the hundreds of small earthquakes per year that the monitoring network detects, is direct evidence that the fault system is active and processing stress. The April 26 magnitude 4 event is the largest in the zone proper since 2005, confirming that the system is not dormant. Under this interpretation, the USG's probability estimates 7 to 10% for magnitude 7 or greater in 50 years, 25 to 40% for magnitude 6 or greater in the same period, are the best available characterization of a real and continuing risk. This interpretation is supported by the broad consensus of federal university and consulting geophysicists who have worked on the New Madrid hazard assessment, including the USG's, SERI at the University of Memphis, and the research teams that produced the FEMA scenario analyses. The USG's has consistently maintained this position through multiple national seismic hazard map update cycles, each involving extensive peer review and expert consensus processes. Interpretation 3, the elevated concern case. Some aspects of the April 26 activity, the 20 earthquakes in 3 weeks preceding the magnitude 4, the characterization of the 4.0 as the strongest in the zone proper in over 20 years, the reports of microseismicity in unusual locations, including the Mark Twain National Forest and areas near Bull Shoals Lake, reflect patterns that warrant closer attention than the standard messaging of no elevated imminent risk conveys. Under this interpretation, the current monitoring data suggests the zone is in a period of elevated activity that may reflect a change in the stress state of the fault system, and that the appropriate response is heightened monitoring attention combined with accelerated preparedness investment, even while acknowledging that prediction of a major rupture is not currently possible. This interpretation is the most speculative of the 3, because the statistical basis for identifying a short-term elevated hazard period from microseismicity patterns in intraplate zones is not well established. The research community does not currently have reliable methods for distinguishing normal variability in microseismicity from genuine precursory activity. The honest assessment of this interpretation is that it is a possibility worth monitoring, but not a conclusion the current data supports with confidence. The weight of the scientific evidence most strongly supports interpretation 2. Ongoing hazard at the probability levels the USG's has consistently estimated, while the elements of interpretation 3 that relate to the April 2026 activity warrant the continued close monitoring that the Center for Earthquake Research and Information is already conducting. Let's be precise about what the scientific record establishes with confidence, what it establishes as probable, and what remains genuinely uncertain. What is established? The New Madrid seismic zone is the most seismically active region of the United States east of the Rocky Mountains, with approximately 200 detected earthquakes per year. The zone produced at least 3 sequences of very large earthquakes over the past 1,500 years, including the 1811 to 1812 sequence that remains the most powerful earthquake series ever recorded east of the Rocky Mountains in North America. The average recurrence interval between these sequences is approximately 500 years, with uncertainty spanning 200 to 800 years. We are currently 215 years past the most recent large sequence. What is established? The geological and engineering conditions in the New Madrid impact zone, deep alluvial sediment, high groundwater table, widespread liquefaction susceptibility, building stock not designed to seismic standards, and the absence of systematic retrofit programs would produce catastrophic consequences from a major rupture. FEMA and USG's scenario analyses project approximately 86,000 casualties, 715,000 damaged buildings, 7.2 million displaced persons, and approximately $300 billion in direct economic losses from a magnitude 7.7 earthquake. The total impact area covers 11.6 million people across 8 states. What is established? A magnitude 4.0 earthquake struck the core of the New Madrid zone on April 23, 2026, the strongest event in the zone proper since 2005, preceded by 20 small earthquakes in the 3 preceding weeks. Nathan Moran of the Center for Earthquake Research and Information at the University of Memphis identified it as providing valuable data from within the core monitoring network, while characterizing the near-term risk of a larger event as low. What is established? The bedrock underlying Memphis is approximately 3,000 feet below the surface, compared to the tens to hundreds of meters typical under seismically prepared California cities. This sediment depth produces significant ground motion amplification and widespread liquefaction susceptibility that would compound the direct effects of any major New Madrid earthquake. What is not established? The timing of the next major New Madrid earthquake. This cannot be determined with current scientific methods. The range from the paleoseismic record spans hundreds of years, and short-term prediction capability exists for intraplate fault systems. The GPS data showing minimal surface strain accumulation is a real measurement that the scientific community is still working to integrate into a consistent physical model of the zone's behavior. It is not established whether the April 2026 microseismicity represents a change in the zone's behavior or normal variability. The monitoring community will continue to assess this, and the data from the April magnitude 4 event itself will provide new information about the fault system's current state. The most frustrating aspect of the New Madrid earthquake hazard is that the preparation gap, the distance between what the region has and what a major rupture would require, is large enough that it cannot be closed on any short timeline, but it is not fixed. It can be reduced, and every year it is not reduced is a year in which the consequences of a major event, if it occurs, are worse than they needed to be. The most immediately actionable preparation measures do not require large capital investment. Public education, genuine, specific, evidence-based earthquake preparedness messaging that explains liquefaction, explains building vulnerability, explains why the Midwest bedrock transmits shaking farther than California's, can be delivered through schools, through emergency management agencies, through public health systems. The basic preparedness measures, water storage, emergency food, emergency contact plans, knowledge of evacuation routes, are inexpensive. What has prevented them from being widely adopted in the New Madrid impact zone is primarily the invisibility of the hazard, not the cost of the preparation. The community-level preparedness exercises, the New Madrid seismic zone Great Shakeout exercises that have been conducted periodically across the 8-state impact area, represent exactly the right framework for building the behavioral preparation that saves lives when the event occurs. The question is whether they are conducted with sufficient frequency, sufficient participation, and sufficient integration into actual emergency management planning to produce meaningful behavioral change. The specific behavioral practices that earthquake preparedness research shows save lives in unexpected onset events like a major New Madrid earthquake are not complicated. Drop cover and hold on during shaking. Moving to open ground away from buildings when the shaking stops, because aftershocks, which in the New Madrid scenario could number in the thousands over weeks and months, can collapse structures already damaged by the main event. Staying away from the river's edge and low-lying areas near the river for hours and days after a major event, because the same fault dynamics that produced the 1812 river reversal could produce surge effects and levee failures in a modern event. Not using elevators in any building for the first 72 hours. Having a meeting point plan for families separated during the daytime event, when school-aged children may be in buildings far from their parents. These behaviors are not California behaviors or West Coast behaviors. They are earthquake behaviors that work regardless of the geology. What the geology of the New Madrid zone adds to the behavioral equation is the specific urgency of getting away from the river and away from low-lying sediment environments as quickly as possible, because those are the environments where liquefaction and its consequences will be most severe and most rapidly progressive. The building code question is more difficult and more expensive. Tennessee's statewide adoption of International Building Code seismic provisions in 2004 was a genuine improvement, but it only applies to new construction and major renovations. It does not mandate retrofit of the existing building stock. A mandatory seismic retrofit program for the highest risk building categories, unreinforced masonry schools, fire stations, hospitals, and emergency services facilities, would reduce the casualty toll from a major event substantially, at costs that would be dwarfed by the costs of the event itself. The political and economic barriers to mandatory retrofit programs are real, but they are not uniquely difficult in the New Madrid region. California overcame them following Northridge. The question is whether the New Madrid region will wait for its own Northridge before acting. The unreinforced masonry school building in Memphis that collapses during a daytime earthquake does not have to collapse. The technology to retrofit it is known and well established. The engineering specifications for making it substantially more seismic resistant are available. The cost of the retrofit is real but quantifiable, and far less than the cost of rebuilding it after collapse, to say nothing of the cost in lives. What has prevented systematic action is not technical capability or economic impossibility. It is the absence of urgency that comes from living in a region that has not had a major earthquake in 215 years. The infrastructure hardening that would protect the Mississippi River bridges and the transcontinental pipeline network requires federal-level investment and coordination. Several of the most critical bridge structures have been identified as seismically vulnerable for years. Retrofitting or replacing a major interstate highway bridge over the Mississippi River is a multi-year, multi-billion-dollar project, but so is the economic disruption from a major bridge failure that cuts the country's road and rail network in two. The cost-benefit calculation for bridge retrofit has been conducted and documented. The political will to act on it has been more intermittent. The Center for Earthquake Research and Information at the University of Memphis, the USGS's Advanced National Seismic System, and the network of state geological surveys that monitor the zone represent the scientific infrastructure that would provide the earliest possible warning of any change in the seismic behavior that preceded a major event. These monitoring programs deserve sustained funding, precisely because they provide the data that both the research community and the emergency management community need to make informed decisions about hazard and preparedness. The April 23rd event's value, as Nathan Moran stated, is in the data it provides from within the core monitoring network, data that will improve the community's understanding of the fault system's current behavior. Every event that the network detects, locates, and characterizes is a contribution to that understanding. The investment in the monitoring infrastructure is the investment in the early warning system. The New Madrid seismic zone will not announce itself. It will not develop over a long warning period, like a hurricane tracked across an ocean for days. The 1811 earthquake that began the sequence striking at 2 in the morning is the template. Sudden, in the dark, in a place where the population had no frame for understanding what was happening to them. The population of the modern Mississippi River Valley has more information available to them than the settlers of 1811, but only if they access and use it. The USG's earthquake catalog for the New Madrid region is publicly accessible. The Center for Earthquake Research and Information at the University of Memphis maintains a public website with the Regional Seismicity Catalog and information about the zone's behavior. The FEMA Shakeout Preparedness exercises are open to public participation. The seismic hazard maps that show ground motion, liquefaction probability, and structural vulnerability at the neighborhood level for Memphis and Shelby County, Tennessee, produced by Chris Kramer and colleagues at the SERI and at the USGS, are published and available. The scenario analyses that project the casualties, building damages, and infrastructure losses from a major event are publicly accessible through the university publications at the Mid-America Earthquake Center at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. The monitoring metrics that this investigation will follow are specific. The USG's earthquake catalog for the New Madrid seismic zone, the record of magnitude, location, and depth for every detected event, provides the baseline data for assessing whether the April 2026 activity represents a temporary cluster or the beginning of a sustained period of elevated microseismicity. The Center for Earthquake Research and Information's aftershock survey of the April 23rd event was underway as of the reporting for this investigation, and its results will contribute to the community of researchers working to understand whether that event provides evidence of a change in the fault system's current stress state. The USG's National Seismic Hazard Map update process, which occurs on a multi-year cycle and incorporates new research on fault behavior, paleo-CI seismology, and ground motion prediction, We'll eventually incorporate the improved understanding of intraplate fault mechanics that research programs like the one documented by Craig, Channard, and Calais in Nature Communications are generating. That improved understanding may shift the estimated probabilities up or down. In either direction, it will represent a more accurate characterization of the real risk. What the April 23, 2026 earthquake made clear, through Nathan Moran's statement that it was the strongest in the zone proper in over 20 years, through the 20 events in 3 weeks that preceded it, through its being felt across several states from a magnitude that in California would barely register, is that the New Madrid seismic zone is not a historical curiosity. It is not a cold, dying fault. It is an active seismic system operating in the most underprepared region of the United States for the consequences it is capable of producing. FEMA's formal assessment is not ambiguous. A major New Madrid earthquake would produce the highest economic losses from any natural disaster in American history. The USG's probability estimates are not negligible. 7 to 10% for a magnitude 7 or greater in 50 years is a real number in a 50-year planning horizon. The building stock, the infrastructure, the liquefaction susceptibility, and the depth of the sediment column beneath Memphis are not opinions. They are measurements. The river ran backward once. The ground opened and swallowed forests. The land rose and fell and created lakes that still exist today. The people who lived through it recorded what they saw in journals and letters that have survived 2 centuries. They described an event they had no framework to anticipate, no preparation to survive, and no infrastructure to recover from. The framework now exists. The preparation is available. The infrastructure investment is technically feasible. The question, the only question, is whether the region will act before the ground moves again, or whether the next generation of witnesses will be writing their own letters from the ruins.
We will be watching the monitoring data. We will be following the SERI aftershock analysis. We will be here when the next seismic catalog update shows whether the April activity has subsided or continues. And we will be here to tell you exactly what the data shows, without alarm and without dismissal, for as long as this story demands. The fault is there. It has moved before. The question of when it moves again is the only thing the science cannot tell us. Everything else, it has told us clearly.